The candlelight flickered across the faces of London's elite as they turned, mouths agape, toward the centre of the ballroom. There, amid the polished marble and beneath the crystal chandeliers, a duke, the most powerful man in England, had fallen to his knees before the woman they had all dismissed as invisible. But this was not where the story began. It began 3 years earlier, when that same woman stood trembling in another ballroom, watching her betrothed dance with her own sister, announcing their engagement to the world that had gathered to celebrate hers. If you are listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which part of the world you are listening from. I want to know how far it has travelled. Miss Penelope Ashford had been taught since childhood that her value lay in silence. The second daughter of Viscount Ashford, she possessed neither her elder sister Arabella's radiant beauty nor her younger brother's charm. What she did possess, a keen mind, a remarkable memory for poetry, and an unfortunate tendency to speak Latin when nervous, were qualities her mother dismissed as impediments to a successful marriage. The Ashford townhouse on Grosvenor Square stood as a testament to faded aristocratic grandeur. Its facade, though elegant, bore the subtle signs of economical maintenance. Inside, however, Lady Ashford ensured that every surface gleamed with borrowed magnificence, for appearances were everything in Regency London, and the Ashfords' fortunes depended entirely on advantageous marriages. Penelope's bedchamber overlooked the square's gardens, and she often stood at the window in the grey hours before dawn, watching the city awaken. At 23, she had endured 4 unsuccessful seasons. 4 years of being led to the dance floor by dutiful second sons, of standing against wallpapered walls while gentlemen's eyes slid past her, of her mother's increasingly desperate whispers about their diminishing options. Then, miraculously, everything had changed. Lord Edmund Fitzwilliam had noticed her, not just noticed, courted her with what appeared to be genuine interest. The second son of the Earl of Pemberton, Edmund possessed considerable fortune from a generous inheritance, classic features that turned heads, and an easy manner that charmed drawing rooms across Mayfair. When he had requested permission to court Penelope, Lady Ashford had wept with relief. "You see, my dear," her mother had said, adjusting Penelope's modest string of pearls, "patience is rewarded. Lord Edmund sees past superficial charms to the steadiness you offer. You shall make him an excellent wife." Steadiness, duty, reliability. These were the words that followed Penelope like shadows. Never passion, never desire, never love. But she had learned not to expect such things. Marriage was a practical arrangement, and Lord Edmund represented security for her and for her family. The morning of their engagement ball dawned cold and bright. March winds rattled the window panes as Penelope submitted to her lady's maid's ministrations. The gown her mother had commissioned was lovely, pale blue silk with delicate embroidery, though it paled beside the crimson creation Arabella would wear. Her elder sister, 2 years married to a wealthy merchant, had returned from her country estate specifically for the occasion. "You've done well, Penny," Arabella had said that morning, her tone carrying that particular condescension reserved for younger siblings. "Edmund is quite the catch, though I confess surprised that he chose you. He could have had his pick of the season's beauties." Penelope had smiled tightly, refusing to let the barb land. She had grown accustomed to such comments, had built armor from years of being overlooked. What did it matter if Edmund's choice seemed improbable? He had chosen her, and that was enough. The day passed in a blur of preparations. The ballroom at Ashford House transformed under the staff's industrious hands. Hothouse flowers arranged in towering displays, hundreds of candles positioned to cast flattering light, refreshment tables laden with delicacies that would strain the household accounts for months. No expense was spared, for this night represented the family's social redemption. As dusk fell, Penelope descended the staircase to find her father waiting in the entrance hall. Viscount Ashford, his face weathered by years of financial anxiety, took her hand with uncharacteristic tenderness. "You look well, daughter," he said quietly. Lord Edmund is a fortunate man. You have always been the steadiest of my children, the one I could depend upon for sense. I trust you shall find contentment. Contentment, not happiness, not joy. But Penelope nodded, accepting this modest hope as her due. The guests began arriving as the clock struck 8. The cream of London society filed through the doors, dowagers dripping with jewels, young bucks in immaculate evening dress, debutantes in their finest gowns. Penelope stood beside her mother, greeting each arrival with practiced courtesy, her heart beating steadily beneath her composure. Lord Edmund arrived fashionably late, as was his custom. He looked magnificent in black evening clothes, his fair hair artfully arranged, his smile easy and confident. He bowed over Penelope's hand with practiced grace, but she noticed his eyes were distant, distracted. "You look charming, my dear," he said, his tone pleasant but perfunctory. "Shall we greet our guests?" They moved through the crowded rooms together, Edmund's hand barely touching her elbow. He smiled and chatted with ease, but Penelope felt increasingly like an accessory he carried rather than a companion he cherished. Still, she told herself this was natural. They were not a love match. Affection would grow with time, as her mother had assured her countless times. Arabella held court near the refreshment table, her beauty and animated conversation drawing admirers. She wore crimson silk that hugged her figure scandalously, and diamonds sparkled at her throat, gifts from her doting husband. When Penelope and Edmund approached, Arabella's smile turned brilliant. "Dear sister, and Lord Edmund, what a lovely couple you make." Her eyes lingered on Edmund with an intensity that made Penelope's stomach tighten. "Edmund, you must tell me about your recent travels. I heard you visited Bath. My husband and I are considering taking the waters next month." Edmund's demeanor shifted subtly. His distraction vanished, replaced by focused attention as he moved closer to Arabella. "Indeed, Lady Thornbury, Bath is remarkable this season. Perhaps I might recommend several establishments." They fell into animated conversation, their voices lowering to intimate tones, while Penelope stood forgotten beside them. She tried to interject once or twice, but neither seemed to hear her. The familiar sensation of invisibility crept over her skin like ice water. The evening wore on. Penelope danced when asked, smiled when appropriate, and watched Edmund's eyes follow Arabella across the room. Again and again, she told herself she was imagining it. Edmund had chosen her. The banns would be read next Sunday. This was merely her sister's natural magnetism attracting attention, but deep in her chest, a small voice whispered warnings she refused to hear. As midnight approached, Lord Ashford called for attention. The moment had come for the formal announcement. Penelope's hands trembled as she moved to the center of the ballroom, Edmund at her side. The assembled guests formed a glittering circle around them. Expectant faces turned toward the couple. "My lords, ladies and gentlemen," Viscount Ashford began, his voice carrying across the sudden silence, "it is my great honor to announce—" "Wait!" The single word, spoken in Edmund's clear tenor, cut through the air like a blade. Every eye turned to him. Penelope's breath caught in her throat. Edmund stepped away from her, his expression troubled but resolute. The space he created between them felt vast as an ocean. "Forgive me," he said, addressing the room but looking at no one. "I cannot proceed with this announcement. I cannot, in good conscience, bind myself to Miss Penelope when my heart belongs to another." The ballroom erupted in gasps and whispers. Penelope stood frozen, her mind refusing to comprehend the words she had heard. This could not be happening. Not here. Not now. Not in front of everyone who had ever dismissed or pitied her. Edmund turned then, his eyes finding Arabella in the crowd. She stood with one hand pressed to her bosom, her expression a perfect portrait of shock. But Penelope, who had known her sister for 23 years, recognized the calculation behind those wide eyes. "Lady Thornbury," Edmund said, his voice gaining strength. "Arabella." I can no longer deny what my heart has known since your return to London. It is you I love, you I have always loved." The whispers became a roar. Penelope's vision narrowed to a tunnel, the faces around her blurring into a mass of shocked expressions and avid eyes. She tried to speak, to move, to do something, but her body had turned to stone. Arabella moved forward, her steps graceful and measured. "Edmund, this is madness. I am a married woman, my sister." "Your marriage is one of convenience only," Edmund interrupted. "You told me yourself that Thornbury understands your arrangement. And as for your sister—" His eyes finally met Penelope's, and in them she saw something worse than cruelty. She saw pity. "Penelope is a good woman. She deserves more than a husband whose heart belongs elsewhere. Surely she sees the mercy in this truth spoken now rather than discovered years hence. Mercy. He called this mercy." Penelope's mother had collapsed into a chair, her fan working frantically. Her father stood rigid, his face drained of color. Around them, the Tun's elite whispered behind gloved hands and painted fans, their eyes gleaming with the delight of witnessing spectacular social disaster. "Edmund, please!" Penelope heard herself whisper, hating the weakness in her voice. "Do not do this." But he was already moving toward Arabella, taking her hand in both of his. "I apologize for the spectacle, but I cannot live a lie. Lady Thornbury has agreed to seek a divorce from her husband, and when she is free, I shall make her my wife." And a divorce. The word fell like a thunderbolt. In 1814, divorce was scandal incarnate, social death for all involved, and Edmund would embrace it for Arabella, beautiful, charming Arabella, while Penelope stood before assembled London as the woman so inadequate that her betrothed had publicly chosen her married sister instead. The ballroom tilted. Penelope's carefully constructed composure, built from years of managing disappointment, cracked like thin ice. She could not breathe, could not think, could only feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her humiliation. "Excuse me," she managed, her voice barely audible, then louder, desperate. "Excuse me." She turned and ran. Behind her, the whispers exploded into a cacophony of shock and delighted scandal. Penelope heard her mother's wail, her father's sharp command, Arabella's theatrical protestations. But she did not stop, could not stop. She fled through the doorway, up the servants' stairs, down the corridor to her chamber. Only when the door closed behind her did she allow herself to collapse, her careful composure shattering into pieces as fine as the porcelain her mother displayed in the drawing room. Penelope pressed her hands over her mouth to stifle the sobs that tore from her throat. But they came anyway, great wrenching sounds of pain and humiliation and rage. Through her tears, she could still see Edmund's face as he turned to Arabella, could still hear the whispers that would follow her for the rest of her life, could still feel the weight of every moment she had been invisible, dismissed, overlooked, culminating in this spectacular public rejection. She had been right to expect nothing. She had merely forgotten how much nothing could hurt. Dawn found Penelope still dressed in her engagement gown, seated at her window watching grey light creep across the square. She had not slept, could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Edmund's face turn toward Arabella, heard the collective gasp of the assembled ton, felt the weight of their stares like brands upon her skin. Somewhere in the house, she heard movement, servants beginning their morning routines, voices conferring in urgent whispers. The household was awake early, no doubt dealing with the aftermath of last night's disaster. A knock at her door made her flinch. "Penelope!" Her mother's voice, raw from crying. "May I enter?" She did not answer, but the door opened anyway. Lady Ashford looked 10 years older than she had yesterday, her face drawn and pale without its usual powders and paints. "Your father has been up all night," she said without preamble, writing letters, calling in favors, attempting to contain the damage. She moved to sit on the edge of Penelope's bed, her movements heavy with exhaustion. "This is catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic." How could Edmund do this? How could Arabella? Penelope turned from the window, her voice flat. You knew, didn't you, that I was not what men desired. You always knew. Oh, my dear child. Lady Ashford's eyes filled with tears. I thought steadiness would be enough. I thought a man of sense would value reliability over whatever madness has possessed Edmund. Love, Penelope said simply. He loves Arabella. He said so in front of everyone who matters in London society. Her mother's expression hardened. Love, as if love matters in marriage. Your father and I married for practical reasons and have managed perfectly well. Edmund has destroyed not only his own reputation but yours, ours, your sister's, all for what? A moment of passionate foolishness? A maid knocked tentatively, entering with a tea tray. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she could not meet Penelope's gaze. Even the servants pitied her now. The girl set the tray down and fled. You must dress, Lady Ashford said after a long moment. We have callers. Callers. Penelope's laugh was bitter. Who would call on us after last night? Exactly the people we need most. Those who have some sympathy or at least curiosity about our perspective on the scandal. We must begin damage control immediately. Her mother stood, smoothing her morning dress. Wear something subdued. Appear dignified, but not devastated. We must show London that we are victims of Edmund's cruel fickleness, not so worthless that even a fortune hunter would abandon me at the altar, Penelope finished. Lady Ashford flinched. That is not what I meant. But it was what everyone would think. Penelope knew the Tun's cruelty intimately. She had witnessed countless reputations shredded over tea and gossip. Now she would be the subject of that gossip. Poor plain Penelope Ashford, so inadequate her betrothed, had publicly chosen her married sister instead. The morning passed in a blur of humiliating condolence calls. Lady Weatherby arrived first, her eyes bright with poorly concealed delight in the scandal. Mrs. Pemberton came next, clucking sympathetically, while clearly storing every detail for later retelling. The Honourable Miss Hartley visited with her mother, both wearing expressions of pity that made Penelope want to scream. Each visitor asked the same questions in slightly different words. Had Penelope suspected Edmund's feelings for Arabella? Had there been prior attachments? What would the family do now? And beneath every inquiry lay the unspoken judgment. What was so wrong with Penelope that Edmund had chosen scandal over marrying her? Through it all, Penelope sat in the drawing-room with her back straight and her hands folded, answering in monosyllables while her mother performed theatrical grief. She felt disconnected from her own body, as though watching the scene from a great distance. Arabella did not appear. Penelope learned from the whispered conversations that her sister had departed at dawn for her husband's country estate, citing sudden illness. Lord Thornbury, upon learning of his wife's involvement in the scandal, had reportedly turned white with rage before bundling Arabella into a carriage. The divorce Edmund had so confidently mentioned seemed far less certain in the cold light of morning. By afternoon, when the parade of false sympathy finally ended, Penelope's composure was fracturing. She escaped to her chamber under the pretense of resting, but rest was impossible. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her with memories of every moment she had believed herself chosen, valued, wanted. Evening brought her father to her door. Viscount Ashford looked exhausted, his eyes sunken and troubled. He entered without speaking and sat heavily in the chair by her fireplace. "I have failed you," he said finally. "I should have inquired more deeply into Lord Edmund's character, should have protected you from this humiliation." "How could you have known?" Penelope asked, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. "He seemed sincere. I believed him sincere." "The Tun will not forget this quickly," her father continued. "I fear your prospects for marriage are now limited. No gentleman will wish to be compared to Edmund, to wonder if you carry a torch for him, or to navigate the scandal that surrounds our family." There it was, the truth spoken plain. She was unmarriageable now, at 23, already on the shelf, and now carrying the taint of spectacular public rejection. No respectable man would have her. "What am I to do?" she whispered. Her father was silent for a long moment. "Your Aunt Agatha has written. She invites you to stay with her in Bath for the season. Perhaps distance from London would be beneficial." Aunt Agatha. Her father's elder sister, a formidable widow who had scandalized the family 30 years ago by refusing to remarry after her husband's death, choosing instead an independent life in Bath's intellectual circles. Penelope had met her only twice, but she remembered a sharp-eyed woman with little patience for social niceties. "Exile," Penelope said flatly. "Refuge," her father corrected. "Agatha is unconventional, but she is also kind, and Bath society is more forgiving than London's. You could begin again, as though she could shed her humiliation like a cloak and emerge renewed. But what choice did she have? Remaining in London meant enduring endless pity and gossip, watching Edmund court Arabella if the divorce proceeded, being forever marked as the wallflower so inadequate her betrothed had chosen scandal over her. "When would I leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you wish. The season is ending here. By the time you return to London next year, some new scandal will have captured everyone's attention." But they would never truly forget. Penelope understood that. The story would follow her always. The wallflower scorned, the sister betrayed, the woman so forgettable even her betrothed had looked through her to someone more worthy. That night, Penelope packed her own trunks, refusing her maid's assistance. She folded away the blue engagement gown, her modest jewelry, the books and letters that comprised her small life. As she worked, something hardened in her chest. A kernel of anger that grew with each garment she put away. Edmund had humiliated her. Arabella had betrayed her. Society had judged her, but she was not dead. She was merely beaten, and there was a difference. Tomorrow she would leave for Bath. Tomorrow she would begin again, though she had no idea what beginning again might mean. But tonight, in the darkness of her chamber, Penelope made herself a promise. She would never again allow herself to be invisible. Never again accept that her value lay only in usefulness to others. Never again mistake patience for contentment. She did not know how she would transform, did not know if redemption was possible for someone like her, but she knew with sudden, fierce certainty that she would not remain the woman Edmund had dismissed, could not remain her. The night wind rattled her window, carrying sounds from the city beyond. Carriages clattering over cobblestones, distant laughter, the complex symphony of London life continuing indifferent to her pain. Somewhere in that city, Edmund and Arabella were perhaps together, perhaps justifying their cruelty to themselves and each other. But Penelope was done thinking about them, done allowing their choices to define her existence. Tomorrow she would leave. And though she could not yet imagine what awaited her in Bath, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would never be a wallflower again. The journey to Bath took 2 days by coach, and Penelope watched the landscape transform through rain-streaked windows. London's grey stone and sooty air gave way to green countryside, then to the golden Bath stone that glowed even under overcast skies. The city rose before her in elegant crescents and terraces, its architecture speaking of Roman antiquity and Georgian refinement. Aunt Agatha's townhouse stood on Gay Street, a handsome 3-story building with flower boxes at every window. Before Penelope could knock, the door swung open to reveal a tall, spare woman in her 60s with sharp grey eyes and silver hair, dressed simply but elegantly. She wore no cap, a small rebellion that marked her as unconventional. "So you're Penelope," Aunt Agatha said, looking her niece up and down with unnerving directness. "Come in. You look exhausted and half-starved. We'll remedy both immediately." No words of sympathy, no theatrical expressions of outrage at Penelope's treatment. Just practical assessment and immediate action. Penelope found herself ushered into a warm drawing room filled with books, comfortable furniture and paintings that spoke of travels abroad. Over tea and substantial sandwiches, Aunt Agatha listened to Penelope's halting account of the engagement ball. When the story ended, the older woman set down her cup with a decisive click. "Your mother," she announced, "is a fool." She raised you to be invisible and then wondered why men overlooked you. And this Edmund creature, he is beneath contempt. As for your sister, Agatha's eyes flashed. Blood relations are accidents of birth. Loyalty must be earned. Arabella has forfeited hers. The blunt assessment, so different from London's coded sympathy, broke something loose in Penelope's chest. She felt tears threatening, but blinked them back. "What am I to do?" she asked, hearing the desperation in her own voice. "I cannot return to London. I have no prospects. I am—" "You are 23 years old, with a functioning mind and a modest dowry that remains intact," Agatha interrupted. "What you are not is doomed to a life of genteel poverty and social ostracism. But we must work quickly before you internalize the role of victim that London's gossips have assigned you." "Work at what?" Agatha smiled, and it was sharp as a blade. "At transforming you into someone no one can overlook. Not through beauty, though we shall improve your presentation considerably, but through wit, knowledge, and the kind of confidence that comes from genuine accomplishment." Over the following days, Penelope discovered that life in Bath bore little resemblance to London's rigid social hierarchies. Aunt Agatha moved in circles of intellectuals, artists, and freethinkers who valued conversation over pedigree. She hosted salons where philosophy was debated, poetry recited, and scientific discoveries discussed with genuine enthusiasm. At first, Penelope merely observed, sitting silently in corners as she had done in London ballrooms. But Agatha would have none of it. "Speak up, girl," she commanded during a discussion of Mary Wollstonecraft's writings. "You've read A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. I saw the volume in your trunk. What did you think of her arguments?" Penelope froze, every instinct telling her to demur, to deflect, to make herself small. But something in Agatha's expectant gaze pulled the words from her. I thought she was correct that education forms character, but perhaps too optimistic about society's willingness to change. We speak of women's rationality, but most women are denied the education that would develop it, and then are blamed for their deficiency." The room fell silent. Penelope's heart hammered. Had she said too much, revealed too much of her own bitter experience? Then a gentleman across the room leaned forward with interest. "An astute observation, Miss Ashford. The circular logic of oppression. Deny the tools, then blame the lack of capability. One sees it in discussions of the working classes as well." The conversation flowed from there, and Penelope found herself drawn in, her ideas sought and considered. No one interrupted her. No one dismissed her contributions. For the first time in her life, she felt truly heard. The gentleman who had responded to her observation was Dr. Elias Reed, a physician who had recently returned from studying medicine in Edinburgh. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair silvered at the temples, intelligent grey eyes, and a serious demeanour that suggested depth rather than dullness. He dressed simply but well, spoke with quiet authority, and possessed the rare gift of listening, as though what others said truly mattered. After that first salon, Dr. Reed began appearing regularly at Aunt Agatha's gatherings. Penelope told herself it was coincidence, that he came for the intellectual discourse, not for her. But she noticed how his eyes sought her across crowded rooms, how he maneuvered to sit near her during discussions, how his questions seemed designed to draw out her thoughts. "You're different from London ladies," he said one evening, as they stood together examining Agatha's collection of botanical prints. "You think rather than merely opine. You question rather than simply accept." "Perhaps I simply had more time to read," Penelope replied, deflecting the compliment as habit dictated. "When one is frequently left sitting out dances, books become companions." "London's loss," Dr. Reed said quietly, "is Bath's gain." Something warm bloomed in Penelope's chest, not the desperate hope she had felt with Edmund, but something steadier, more real. She looked at Dr. Reed's serious face and allowed herself to imagine just for a moment that his interest might be genuine. But old wounds do not heal quickly. That night, alone in her chamber, Penelope's mind turned treacherous. What if Dr. Reed was simply being kind? What if he pitied her? What if his attention was merely intellectual, born of respect for her mind, while he found her person as unremarkable as every other man had? The doubts circled like vultures, feeding on years of evidence that she was forgettable, dismissible, inadequate. Yet as summer progressed, Bath worked its subtle magic. Agatha insisted on new gowns in colours Penelope had never worn, deep emerald, rich burgundy, sapphire blue. She taught her niece to dress her hair in more flattering styles, to hold her head high, to speak with authority rather than apology. Confidence, Agatha said one morning as she supervised Penelope's transformation, is not a gift granted by others' approval. It is a choice you make, despite their disapproval. Choose it, Penelope. Every day, choose it. More challenging than the external changes was the internal work. Agatha gave her books on philosophy, science, and politics. She encouraged Penelope to write essays on subjects that interested her, then critiqued them with scholarly rigor. She introduced her to women who had created independent lives, a novelist who supported herself through her pen, a naturalist who had traveled to Italy alone, a mathematician who published under a male pseudonym. These women showed Penelope possibilities she had never imagined. They proved that a woman might define herself by her accomplishments rather than by which man chose her. They demonstrated that contentment need not come from meeting society's expectations, but from exceeding one's own. Slowly, carefully, like a plant turning towards sunlight, Penelope began to unfold. She wrote an essay on educational reform that was published anonymously in a local journal. She joined a lending library and attended lectures at the assembly rooms. She learned to express opinions without prefacing them with apologies. She discovered that her mind, so long trained to quietness, could be sharp and incisive when given freedom to engage. And through it all, Dr. Reed's presence remained constant. He walked with her through Bath's crescents, discussing everything from medical advances to political reform. He brought her books from his own library. He sought her opinions on his work, establishing a charitable clinic for the city's poor. One afternoon in late August, as they walked through Sydney Gardens, Dr. Reed turned to her with unusual nervousness. "Miss Ashford, Penelope, if I may, I must speak plainly. I know you came to Bath seeking refuge from painful circumstances. I know that trust, once broken, is not easily mended. But I find myself hoping—" He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I find myself hoping that you might consider me as more than a friend. Not now, perhaps. Not until you are ready. But someday, if you could." "Why?" The word escaped before Penelope could stop it. "Why would you want someone like me?" Dr. Reed's expression turned fierce. "Someone like you? You mean someone intelligent, thoughtful, possessed of both moral courage and intellectual rigor? Someone who asks genuine questions rather than parroting fashionable opinions? Someone whose conversation challenges and delights me in equal measure?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Penelope, I have no interest in insipid beauty or practiced charm. I want substance. I want you." The tears came then, sudden and overwhelming. Not tears of pain, but of something far more dangerous. Hope. Real hope, not the desperate grasping she had felt with Edmund, but the steady belief that perhaps she might be chosen not for convenience or pity, but for herself. "I'm afraid," she whispered, "afraid of being wrong again, afraid of misunderstanding, afraid of—" "Of course you are afraid," Dr. Reed said gently. "I would think less of you if you were not. But fear need not dictate action. We can proceed slowly. We can build trust through time. I ask only that you do not dismiss the possibility." Penelope looked into his eyes, grey and steady and infinitely patient, and made a choice. Not commitment, not yet, but openness to possibility, the willingness to risk again despite the scars she carried. "I will consider it," she said. "I will try." His smile was warm as sunlight. "That is all I ask." As summer faded into autumn, Penelope realized she had not thought about Edmund or Arabella in weeks. The wound they had inflicted still ached at times, but it no longer defined her. She was becoming someone new, or perhaps discovering who she had always been beneath the layers of imposed invisibility. She was becoming Penelope Ashford, not as society defined her, but as she chose to be. October arrived with crisp mornings and golden light that turned Bath's honey-coloured stone luminous. Aunt Agatha announced without preamble that they would attend the season's opening assembly at the upper rooms. "It is time," she said, brooking no argument, "for you to re-enter society, not as a supplicant seeking acceptance, but as yourself, confident, accomplished, and entirely indifferent to others' judgments." Penelope felt her old anxieties rising. "Agatha, I'm not certain I'm ready. The assembly will be full of people who know about London, about Edmund." "Precisely why you must attend," Agatha interrupted. "You cannot hide forever. More importantly, you should not. You have transformed, Penelope. It is time Bath society witnessed that transformation." The gown Agatha commissioned was unlike anything Penelope had worn before, deep emerald silk that made her hazel eyes appear green, cut in the latest fashion with delicate embroidery at the bodice and hem. The modiste had insisted on a lower neckline than Penelope was accustomed to, revealing collarbones she had always hidden. When she descended Aunt Agatha's staircase the evening of the assembly, Dr. Reed, who had arrived to escort them, went still. His eyes widened, and for a long moment he simply stared. "You look—" He seemed to struggle for words. "Magnificent." The assembly rooms blazed with candlelight and rang with conversation. As Penelope entered on Dr. Reed's arm, with Aunt Agatha formidable at her other side, she felt eyes turned toward her. For once, the attention did not make her want to disappear. She held her head high, her hand steady on Dr. Reed's sleeve, and met curious gazes with calm directness. They had barely entered the ballroom when a familiar voice cut through the chatter. "Miss Ashford, Penelope." She turned to find Lady Charlotte Humphrey, one of Arabella's particular friends from London, staring at her with poorly concealed shock. Lady Charlotte had been present at the disastrous engagement ball, had been among the first to spread gossip about Penelope's humiliation. "Lady Charlotte," Penelope said coolly, "what a surprise to encounter you in Bath." "Yes, well, I am taking the waters for my health." Lady Charlotte's eyes travelled over Penelope's appearance, her expression registering disbelief. "You look quite different. I hardly recognized you." "How kind of you to say so." Penelope's smile was polite but entirely insincere. Lady Charlotte lowered her voice conspiratorially. "I suppose you've heard about Lord Edmund and your sister. The divorce proceedings have been delayed indefinitely. Lord Thornbury refuses to cooperate, and Edmund's family has threatened to cut him off entirely if he persists in this madness. He's quite desperate, I understand." "How unfortunate for him," Penelope said, and meant it. Not with bitterness, but with genuine indifference. Edmund's fate no longer had the power to wound her. Dr. Reed's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, a subtle gesture of support. Lady Charlotte's eyes tracked the movement, her expression sharpening with speculation. "And who is your companion?" she asked with false sweetness. "Dr. Elias Reed," he said before Penelope could respond. "Miss Ashford and I are close friends." The way he said it left no doubt that friendship might evolve into something more. Lady Charlotte's eyebrows rose. "How progressive. A physician." Her tone made it clear what she thought of Penelope forming an attachment with someone who actually worked for his living, even in such a respected profession. "An educated, accomplished gentleman whose company I value greatly," Penelope replied, her voice carrying an edge of steel. "I find substance far more appealing than empty titles, Lady Charlotte. But then, I suppose, our values differ." Before Lady Charlotte could respond, Aunt Agatha intervened with the smooth authority of decades of social manoeuvring. "Come, Penelope. I see the Duchess of Marlow has arrived. She has been eager to meet you after reading your essay on educational reform." They swept away, leaving Lady Charlotte gaping. As they crossed the ballroom, Penelope felt something fierce and bright flowering in her chest. Not revenge exactly, but a deep satisfaction in no longer being the meek, apologetic creature London had tried to make her. The evening unfolded with unexpected triumph. The Duchess of Marlowe, a formidable intellectual in her own right, engaged Penelope in a lengthy discussion about women's education that drew a crowd of interested listeners. A prominent local magistrate sought her opinion on criminal reform. A celebrated poet praised her essay and invited her to submit to a quarterly review he edited. Through it all, Dr. Reed remained attentive but not possessive, allowing Penelope to shine without overshadowing her. She caught him watching her once, his expression filled with such open admiration that her breath caught. This was different from Edmund's casual attention. This was genuine. This was real. They were taking refreshment when a disturbance at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Penelope turned with the crowd and froze. Edmund stood in the doorway. He looked haggard, his face thinner than she remembered, his clothes still elegant, but somehow diminished. His eyes scanned the ballroom desperately, and when they found Penelope, he started forward with visible relief. "Miss Ashford!" He pushed through the crowd toward her, oblivious to the whispers his appearance generated. "Thank God I've found you. I've been searching for you for weeks. Your family refused to reveal your location, but I finally learned from Lady Charlotte that you were in Bath." Dr. Reed stepped subtly closer to Penelope, his posture protective. Aunt Agatha materialized at her other side, her expression glacial. "Lord Edmund," Penelope said, pleased that her voice remained steady, "I am surprised to see you here. I had to come. I had to speak with you." Edmund's voice carried across the now silent ballroom. They had become the evening's entertainment. "Penelope, I have been such a fool. The situation with your sister, it was madness, temporary insanity. The divorce is impossible, and I see now that it was never meant to be, but you and I, we were meant to be. Surely you understand. Surely you can forgive." "No." The single word, spoken with perfect clarity, stopped Edmund mid-sentence. Penelope stepped forward, away from Dr. Reed's protective presence, claiming her own ground. "No, Lord Edmund, I do not understand, and no, I cannot forgive. You humiliated me in front of everyone who mattered in London society. You declared your love for my married sister and announced your intention to pursue a scandal-laden divorce to claim her. You destroyed not only your own reputation but mine, treating me as though I were so inconsequential that my feelings need not be considered." "I was confused," Edmund protested. "I thought I loved Arabella, but I see now." "You see now that the divorce is impossible and your family threatens to cut you off," Penelope interrupted, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "You see now that scandal and social ostracism are less appealing than you imagined. You see now that a reliable, biddable wife like me might be convenient to salvage your situation. But I am no longer that woman, Edmund. I am no longer willing to be chosen by default, valued for convenience, or treated as an acceptable substitute when more desirable options prove unavailable." The crowd's whispers built to a roar. Edmund's face flushed dark red. "Penelope, please. I made a terrible mistake. I'm trying to make amends." "Your amends are not wanted," Penelope's heart thundered, but her voice remained level. "I wish you well, Lord Edmund. I hope you find what you're looking for, but you will not find it with me. I have moved beyond that life, beyond those expectations, beyond the person I was when I believed your attention was an honor I should be grateful for." He turned away then, decisively, and found Dr. Reed watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. Pride, admiration, and something deeper, warmer, that promised steady devotion rather than dramatic passion. "Shall we dance?" he asked quietly, extending his hand. Penelope placed her hand in his, feeling the rightness of the choice. As they moved onto the dance floor, leaving Edmund standing abandoned in the center of the ballroom, she heard the whispers shift, no longer pitying poor Penelope Ashford, now admiring her dignity, her transformation, her strength. The assembly had witnessed her resurrection. As the music swelled, and Dr. Reed guided her through the dance with practiced skill, Penelope allowed herself to smile, not with bitterness or triumph, but with genuine joy. She had faced her past and dismissed it. She had claimed her worth not through a man's validation, but through her own transformation. Later, as the evening wound toward midnight, Dr. Reed walked with her and Aunt Agatha back to Gay Street. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and autumn flowers. At the door, Dr. Reed took her hand. "You were remarkable tonight." "I was honest," Penelope corrected. "Perhaps for the first time in my life I was simply honest about who I am and what I will accept." "Oh, then honesty becomes you." He hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. "Penelope, I will wait as long as you need. But I hope you know that my regard for you is not temporary, not conditional, not a matter of convenience. You are extraordinary, and I count myself fortunate to know you." This time, Penelope did not deflect the compliment or question his sincerity. She simply accepted it, allowed it to settle into the spaces in her heart that Edmund's cruelty had torn open. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me, for waiting, for being precisely who you are." As she climbed the stairs to her chamber that night, Penelope realized something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer running from her past or hiding from society's judgment. She was building a future on her own terms, with her own choices, surrounded by people who valued her for herself. The wallflower had bloomed, and no one, not Edmund, not Arabella, not London's cruel ton, could make her wilt again. November brought storms that lashed Bath's elegant streets and rattled window panes through long nights. Penelope spent those weeks in Aunt Agatha's warm study, writing essays, reading voraciously, and engaging in lengthy conversations about her future with the woman who had become more mother to her than Lady Ashford had ever been. "You know he intends to propose," Agatha said one grey afternoon as they took tea. "Dr. Reed, he's been remarkably patient, but his intentions are clear." Penelope set down her cup carefully. "I know. And?" Agatha's sharp eyes missed nothing. "What do you feel about that?" "I feel—" Penelope paused, searching for honesty. "I feel that he is a good man, an extraordinary man in many ways. He sees me as I wish to be seen. He values what I value. He makes me laugh, makes me think, makes me believe I might be capable of more than I imagined." "But," Agatha prompted. "But I am still afraid," Penelope admitted. "Afraid of trusting my judgment after Edmund, afraid of being wrong again, afraid that someday he will see something in someone else, someone more beautiful, more charming, more worthy, and I will once again be the woman left behind." Agatha was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was unusually gentle. "Fear is a poor foundation for decisions, my dear, but wisdom is different from fear. Wisdom acknowledges risk while choosing courage. The question is not whether you might be hurt. Life offers no guarantees against pain. The question is whether Dr. Reed's character and your feelings for him justify the risk." "How does one know?" Penelope whispered. "You know," Agatha said simply, "when the thought of refusing him feels worse than the risk of accepting." 2 days later, on a rare, clear afternoon, Dr. Reed invited Penelope to walk with him through the Abbey churchyard. The ancient stones glowed in pale sunlight, and the air smelled of damp earth and approaching winter. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a quiet corner where a bench overlooked the city spreading below. Dr. Reed guided her to sit, then turned to face her with unusual formality. "Penelope!" he began, and she heard the nervousness beneath his controlled tone. "I have tried to be patient, have tried to give you time to heal, to trust, to discover yourself free from the expectations others placed upon you. But I find I can wait no longer to speak plainly about my intentions." Her heart began to race. "Elias, please let me finish." He took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I am not a romantic man by nature. I deal in facts, in evidence, in observable truth. And the truth I have observed is this: You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Your intelligence challenges me, your kindness humbles me, your courage to transform yourself, to stand against those who diminished you, to build a life of substance and meaning, inspires me daily." He drew a breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I do not offer you a title or vast wealth. I can give you a comfortable home, meaningful work if you desire it, partnership in building something worthwhile. But most of all, I offer you respect, admiration, and a devotion that will not waver when younger, prettier faces appear. I am not asking you to complete me or to fulfill some romantic ideal. I am asking you to build a life alongside me, as equals, as companions, as people who choose each other daily." Tears pricked Penelope's eyes. This was not Edmund's careless courtship or dramatic declarations. This was real. This was offering her a choice, not imposing a destiny. "I want to say yes," she whispered, "but Elias, I'm so afraid of being wrong again, afraid of misunderstanding." "You are not wrong," he interrupted gently. "I am here. I am constant, and I will remain so. Penelope, I am asking you to marry me not because you are convenient or because my other options have failed. I am asking because I want you, specifically, particularly, entirely you, as my wife and partner." She looked into his serious face, seeing the sincerity in every line, the steadiness she had come to depend upon. And she realized that Agatha was right. Refusing him would hurt worse than accepting him. The risk of pain paled beside the certainty of regret. "Yes," he said, and felt the words settle into truth. "Yes, Elias, I will marry you." His smile transformed his usually serious expression into something radiant. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise. "Thank you. You have made me extraordinarily happy." They sat together as afternoon faded toward evening, making plans for a quiet wedding, discussing his charitable clinic and how she might contribute, imagining a future built on shared values and genuine partnership. When they returned to Aunt Agatha's house, the older woman took one look at their faces and smiled. "Well, it's about time." The wedding was held 6 weeks later, in December at Bath Abbey. It was a small affair. Aunt Agatha and her intellectual circle, Dr. Reed's colleagues from the hospital, a few genuinely kind acquaintances Penelope had made in Bath. Notably absent were her parents and siblings, though she had written to inform them. Her father had sent a brief letter of congratulations and a modest wedding gift. Her mother had not responded at all. The morning of her wedding, Penelope stood before her mirror in a gown of ivory silk, simpler than the elaborate creation she would have worn marrying Edmund, but infinitely more suited to who she had become. Aunt Agatha helped arrange a wreath of winter greenery in her hair. "You are certain?" Agatha asked, meeting Penelope's eyes in the mirror. "I am certain," Penelope replied, and meant it. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. "Doctor." Reed's voice remained steady as he spoke his vows, but his eyes shone with emotion. When it was Penelope's turn, she spoke the traditional words, but added her own. "I choose you. Today and every day, I choose you." Afterward, there was a small wedding breakfast at a local inn. The conversation flowed easily, full of laughter and intellectual debate. Penelope looked around at the gathering, at Aunt Agatha, deep in discussion with a university professor, at Dr. Reed's colleagues sharing medical anecdotes, at the women who had shown her that life could be lived on one's own terms, and felt profound gratitude. This was her chosen family. These were her people. As evening approached, she and Elias departed for the small house he had prepared for them near the clinic. It was modest but comfortable, filled with books and space for her writing desk, with a garden that would bloom come spring. That night, as Penelope stood at her new home's window watching stars emerge over Bath's rooftops, Elias came to stand beside her. He did not speak, simply took her hand in his. "Are you happy?" he asked finally. Penelope considered the question seriously. Was she happy? Yes, but it was a different happiness than she had imagined in her youth. not the breathless romance of novels or the social triumph her mother had dreamed for her. Instead, it was the steady contentment of being truly known and genuinely valued, the satisfaction of work that mattered and partnership that challenged her to grow, the deep relief of no longer hiding who she was. "I am happy," she said, "more than I knew how to hope for." "Good," Elias said simply. "That is all I want. Your happiness, your flourishing. Everything else is secondary." In London, she knew, the gossip about her marriage to a mere physician would be circulating. Lady Charlotte would be describing it as a come-down, proof that poor Penelope had been forced to settle. Edmund might be consoling himself that he had dodged a bullet, marrying a woman who had fallen so far below her station. Her mother was probably mortified, but their opinions held no power over her anymore. She had learned, through pain and transformation, that their judgment said more about them than about her. She had discovered that a life of substance mattered more than a life of status. She had chosen her path, and it was right. As December snow began to fall over Bath, coating the golden stone in white, Penelope turned from the window and toward her new husband, her new life, her new self. The wallflower was gone. In her place stood a woman who had been scorned, broken, and rebuilt into something far stronger than she had been before, and she was only beginning. Spring came to Bath with a riot of colour that made the city's elegant crescents seem almost impossibly beautiful. 18 months had passed since Penelope's wedding, and the small house near the clinic had become a true home, filled with books, conversation, and the quiet joy of partnership lived daily. Penelope stood in her garden, surveying the roses she had planted the previous autumn. They were blooming now, deep red and pristine white, climbing the stone walls with determined vigor. She wore a simple morning dress, her hair loosely braided, and ink stains marked her fingers. She had been writing before the spring sunshine had lured her outside. "Admiring your handiwork?" Elias appeared from the house, medical bag in hand, but pausing to appreciate the garden. "They're magnificent." "They are survivors," Penelope replied with a smile. "I chose varieties known for hardiness rather than merely beauty. They will bloom year after year if properly tended." The metaphor was not lost on either of them. Penelope had learned that beauty alone was fleeting, but strength endured. She had cultivated her own strength carefully, deliberately, and now it was blooming in ways she could never have imagined in London. The past 18 months had been transformative in unexpected ways. Penelope had become deeply involved in Elias's charitable clinic, not as a decorative patroness, but as an active participant. She had learned basic nursing skills, kept detailed records that improved their understanding of disease patterns, and written compelling appeals for funding that had expanded their services considerably. But her greatest accomplishment was establishing a school for working-class girls adjacent to the clinic. Using her modest dowry and funds, raised through her now extensive network of Bath intellectuals, she had created an institution that taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and practical skills that would enable young women to support themselves. The school had opened 6 months ago with 12 students. Now it served nearly 40. "I had a letter from Aunt Agatha this morning," Penelope said as they walked together through the garden. "She's coming for tea this afternoon and bringing someone she wants me to meet. She was mysteriously vague about who." Elias laughed. "Your aunt is always either completely blunt or deliberately cryptic. I wonder which this guest warrants." They were taking tea in the drawing room when Aunt Agatha arrived, and with her was a young woman of perhaps 19, plainly dressed but with intelligent eyes and nervous hands that twisted a handkerchief. "Penelope, Elias, may I present Miss Sarah Whitmore," Agatha said. "Sarah has recently come to Bath seeking employment as a governess, but she finds herself in difficult circumstances." The story came out over tea. Miss Whitmore had been engaged to a young gentleman of good family, but he had jilted her at the altar in favour of her wealthier cousin. The scandal had destroyed her reputation and her prospects. She had fled to Bath, hoping to start anew, but found that the scandal had followed her. As Sarah spoke, Penelope saw herself 3 years ago, humiliated, lost, believing herself worthless because someone else had discarded her. She reached across and took the young woman's trembling hand. "Miss Whitmore," she said gently, "your story is not ended. It is merely beginning in a direction you did not anticipate. I know this because I lived it. I too was publicly rejected by my betrothed in favor of another. I too came to Bath broken and believing myself beyond redemption. But I was wrong, and so are you." Sarah's eyes widened. "You? But you seem so confident, so accomplished. I cannot imagine—" "I was not always thus," Penelope interrupted. "I had to learn confidence, had to build accomplishment through daily choice and effort, and you can do the same." She glanced at Elias, who nodded encouragement. "My school for girls needs an additional teacher. The pay is modest but sufficient to live on. More importantly, the work is meaningful. You would be giving young women tools to build independent lives. Would you be interested?" Sarah's face transformed with hope. "You would hire me, despite the scandal?" "I care nothing for scandal," Penelope said firmly. "I care about character, competence, and commitment. Aunt Agatha would not have brought you here if you lacked those qualities. The question is whether you want to define yourself by what was done to you or by what you choose to become." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. "I choose to become more. I choose to start again." "Then we shall begin tomorrow," Penelope said, and felt Elias's warm hand cover hers in silent approval. After Sarah and Agatha departed, Penelope and Elias remained in the drawing room as evening light slanted through the windows. He pulled her to sit beside him on the settee, his arm around her shoulders. "You were magnificent with that young woman," he said. "Seeing you transform your own pain into aid for others is— Penelope, you humble me daily with your capacity for growth." "I had good teachers," she replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "You, Aunt Agatha, the women here who showed me that life could be lived differently. Have you heard anything from London recently?" Elias asked carefully. He knew this topic could still cause pain, though the wound had healed to a scar. "My father writes occasionally. He says Edmund finally married, not Arabella, who remains trapped in her unhappy marriage to Lord Thornbury, but a young heiress whose fortune was sufficient to redeem his social standing. My mother apparently hosted the wedding and pretends the scandal with me never occurred." "And how do you feel about that?" Penelope considered the question honestly. "Indifferent, mostly. Sometimes there is a twinge, not of longing for Edmund, but of sadness for the girl I was, who thought his notice mattered so much. But then I look at my life now, and I'm grateful. If he had not rejected me, I would never have come here, never have met you, never have discovered who I could become." "Everything happens for a reason?" Elias asked skeptically. He was too much a man of science for such romanticism. "No," Penelope corrected. "I think terrible things happen randomly and without purpose, but we give them meaning through how we respond. Edmund's cruelty had no noble purpose, but my choice to transform rather than succumb, that was purposeful. That made the difference." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and the first stars emerged. Penelope thought about the journey that had brought her here, from wallflower to exile to scholar to teacher to wife. Each step had felt impossible until she took it. Each transformation had required courage she did not know she possessed until circumstances demanded it. Somewhere in London, gossips might still whisper about poor Penelope Ashford, who had been rejected for her own sister and forced to marry a mere physician. Let them whisper. Their narrow understanding of success and happiness did not define her reality. Her reality was this: a home filled with books and meaningful work, a partner who saw her as an equal and cherished her daily, a school full of young women learning to build independent lives, essays published under her own name on education reform and women's rights, a network of friends who valued intellect and character over pedigree and wealth, a garden where hardy roses bloomed despite frost and storm, This was triumph, not the triumph her mother had imagined, titled husband, grand estate, social prominence, but something far more valuable, the triumph of becoming fully herself. Weeks later, on a warm May afternoon, the school held its first public examination. The girls demonstrated their learning before an audience of potential donors and interested citizens. Penelope watched with fierce pride as young women who had entered the school barely literate now read complex passages, solved mathematical problems, and discussed philosophy with confidence. After the examination, as guests mingled in the garden, Penelope found herself approached by a distinguished elderly gentleman she did not recognize. "Mrs. Reed," he said, "I wonder if I might have a word." He introduced himself as the Duke of Westmere, recently come to Bath to take the waters. "I was moved by what I witnessed today," he continued. "This educational experiment of yours, it is precisely the kind of practical philanthropy England needs. I should like to discuss funding an expansion, perhaps schools in other cities, following your model." As they spoke, outlining possibilities and practical considerations, Penelope noticed other guests watching with interest. Among them was Lady Charlotte Humphrey, who had come to Bath for the season and now stood gaping at the sight of Penelope in earnest discussion with one of England's most influential dukes. When the conversation concluded and the Duke moved away, Lady Charlotte approached, with ill-concealed curiosity. "Mrs. Reed," she said, her tone overly familiar, "I had not realized you had such connections. The Duke of Westmere is quite particular about whom he associates with." "The Duke," Penelope replied coolly, "is interested in substantive work, not social connections. We share concerns about education reform. It is common interest, not social climbing, that facilitates our discussion." Lady Charlotte's expression soured. "Yes, well, I suppose you have found your niche here in Bath, though I must say, when I think of how you were meant to be Lady Fitzwilliam, and now you're merely a physician's wife teaching poor girls their letters." "You're right," Penelope interrupted, her voice carrying an edge that made Lady Charlotte blink. "I am merely a physician's wife, merely a teacher, merely someone who has found purpose and partnership and genuine contentment. How terribly unremarkable of me." She walked away, leaving Lady Charlotte sputtering, and found Elias waiting at the garden gate. He had witnessed the exchange, and his eyes danced with suppressed laughter. "Merely a physician's wife," he quoted. "Should I be insulted?" "You should be proud," Penelope replied, taking his arm. "Because I am. Proud of what we've built together, proud of the life we've chosen." And as they walked home through Bath's elegant streets, Penelope reflected on how completely her definition of success had transformed. 3 years ago, she would have measured her worth by which man chose her, what title she married, how society regarded her. Now she measured worth differently, by work that mattered, relationships built on genuine regard, choices that aligned with her values. The wallflower had not merely bloomed. She had become an entirely different plant, hardy, strong, beautiful in ways that transcended conventional prettiness. And in becoming herself fully, she had found happiness more profound than any she could have imagined in London's ballrooms. That evening, as Penelope sat at her writing desk, composing a letter to the Duke about the proposed school expansion, Elias came to stand behind her chair. He rested his hands gently on her shoulders. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The life you were meant to have? Grand estates, titled husband, social prominence?" Penelope set down her pen and turned to look up at him, at this serious, kind, brilliant man who saw her as she truly was and loved what he saw. "Never," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. "That life would have required me to remain small, to hide who I was, to measure my worth by others' judgments. This life allows me to be large, authentic, purposeful. How could I miss something that would have diminished me?" She stood and moved into his embrace, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness she had come to depend upon. Outside her window, the hardy roses climbed toward the stars, and somewhere in the city, Young women slept in dormitories of the school she had built, dreaming of futures they were learning to create. This was triumph. This was victory. Not because a duke had knelt before her, though that would come in time, in circumstances she could not yet imagine, but because she had knelt before herself and chosen to rise transformed. The wallflower had bloomed, and the garden she created would flourish long after the gossips of London had forgotten her name. If you've been listening to this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments which corner of the world you're tuning in from. I want to know just how far this tale has traveled.